What's going on, guys? Formula One finally came back, and it actually gave us a pretty interesting weekend. It's the 2026 Miami Grand Prix race recap. It's gonna be a lot of fun. We actually saw some really interesting things. The race gave us a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And honestly, over the course of the weekend, I have a lot of questions that some of these teams really need to get answering. So let's go ahead, jump on into this race weekend recap. We're going to go ahead and talk about our race quick hits, our weekend winners and losers. We're going to take a look back at the predictions that we made before the weekend began. Then we'll take a look at our 3 lingering questions as we now head into another break before Canada. And then finally, we'll take a look ahead and see just what is next on the calendar. But let's go ahead, without further ado, jump on into this with our weekend quick hits. Where else could we possibly start on our quick hits besides our race winner? Kimi Antonelli officially goes 3 in a row, converting not only 3 wins in a row, but 3 pole positions into 3 wins. He is, I believe, the youngest driver to convert, or the first driver to ever convert his first 3 Grand Prix poles into wins. That is a bit of a convoluted record, but nonetheless, he did it. And it was a very impressive outing from Kimi Antonelli, as he is now the first driver to hit 100 points on this young season. And it is very clear that he is having nothing against the idea that George Russell is destined for this championship. He now is, 26 points ahead of a second place in the championship. And it is going to get very interesting if this form can continue. But that said, we did see last season where Oscar Piastri led for like a majority of the season, that all it takes is one bad run for it to end. So it is still very much too early to really be talking about it in earnest. But at the same time, it is very interesting to see Kimi Antonelli really stepping up his game after last season. So he takes the win here. Very, very impressive stuff from the young sophomore Mercedes driver. But I think the bigger story across this weekend is actually McLaren, because McLaren, after an abysmal first 2 rounds of the season, have responded in a big way. And they have truly, I think, shown what we probably should have expected when the season began. I think the way that Australia went, and obviously the double DNS in China, had a lot of the impressions many of us were facing at this point. But ultimately, I think McLaren actually had the more impressive weekend overall, taking a 1-2 in the sprint race, as well as taking a double podium. Double podium? No, not a double podium. Double podium? Double podium? Double podium? Double podium? Double podium? Double podium in the Grand Prix as well. And so it is a fantastic weekend for McLaren. Lando Norris ended up taking the win in the sprint race, Oscar Piastri P2, and then in the Grand Prix itself, Lando Norris also took 2nd position, and Oscar Piastri rounded out the podium in P3. So a fantastic weekend if you're a Papaya fan, and it truly probably should be where we would have been seeing them all season if they didn't have such a crazy bad start at the beginning of the year. I think it's time to start talking about Ferrari potentially staring their season in the face. And by that, I think I mean we kind of in the inverse to McLaren. I think Ferrari was such a benefactor to the McLaren struggles to start the season that Ferrari's expectations rose exponentially. But here we are 4 rounds in, and it has come back to earth, I think, quite a bit. I think McLaren finally got things together and have probably overtaken Ferrari for the 2nd fastest car behind Mercedes. And while Ferrari still had a pretty decent showing, and ultimately in the Grand Prix, Lewis Hamilton had damage, and so there was only so much that he was going to be able to do. It is one of those things where McLaren came out so good for the weekend that I think it's time to start talking about Ferrari potentially being a sort of step down from where many of us may have assumed they were after these first few weekends. Obviously, time will tell. It was a 6-week break before Miami. We are going into another 3-week break before Canada. Canada also historically has not been one of Ferrari's best tracks, and so it's going to get very interesting from here, because I think just as quickly as the expectations rose, I think they can crash just as fast. But let's go ahead and talk about Max Verstappen, who probably had the most exciting Sunday out of anyone. He ends up qualifying on the front row, starts alongside Kimi Antonelli, before ultimately spinning, coming out of basically out of turn 1 into turn 2, depending on how you want to look at it. and he found himself playing catch up essentially the entire rest of the race. He ended up pitting pretty early and then made his way on a very, very, very long stint on hards and ends up taking a very respectable finish back there in the top 5. But at the end of the day, it is quite the defeat from him. I like Minio, was really surprised. 1, there was no contact on his spin, but 2, with how tough that Red Bull has looked this season, to see just how well he was able to do to march back through the field. And so it was definitely I think still a solid weekend for Max. It's still one of those things that time will tell where he and Red Bull ultimately shake out. But I think ultimately, I think this has to be considered a pretty solid weekend for Max Verstappen and Red Bull. Speaking of solid weekends, what a weekend for Miami. Miami, I think, as a track and as a weekend, has sort of cemented itself as a requirer of chaos. But when the chaos comes, it just gives us some very enticing moments. You obviously have Max Verstappen spinning on turn 1. You have Isaac Hadjar clipping the inside wall of the uphill left-right chicane before the back straight. You have Pierre Gasly and Liam Lawson coming together and just Pierre Gasly doing a full barrel roll into the outside barrier. And it was one of those weekends that it ultimately delivered due to these incidents, I think. There was the threat of rain lingering throughout the Grand Prix. It didn't actually end up happening, but regardless, I think Miami thrives on chaos. When it doesn't get it, I think it definitely can hold it back. But this weekend was a solid Miami Grand Prix that does not make Miami a good track and a good weekend. But when there is that chaos factor, I think it does just make it a little more entertaining. So we're going to take it for what it's worth. And if we get a decent Miami Grand Prix weekend, I think that's a win for us. And then finally, my last point for the weekend, a big talking point going into the weekend were these regulation adjustments. You know, the FIA came in and adjusted how much the cars can, renew energy over the course of a lap, how much they can deploy over a single lap, and then sort of just some other tweaks that I am not nearly smart enough to break down. But I think it produced a very interesting-ish sort of race. But I think these regulations obviously still very much have a lot to show us. I think with the new announcement coming out about the FIA potentially going back to V8s, I think is showing just kind of what they think of these regulations long term. But I definitely still need to see more with these regulations. Obviously, I think there's still going to need to be a lot of tweaking going on. But ultimately, I do think it gave us enough of that chaos to make this weekend a little more entertaining. So I'm taking the win, like I said, and we'll just move on and we'll wait and see how this does in Canada. All right, let's move on now to our weekend winners and losers. We will begin with our weekend winner. And honestly, I don't know how much I'm really going to have to say with this because I sort of said a lot of my thoughts already. My weekend winners for the Miami Grand Prix weekend are McLaren as a team. Not only did they take a win in the sprint race, it was a 1-2 in the sprint race and a double podium in the Grand Prix. It wasn't a 1-2, but a 2-3 again, very securely being the second fastest car over the course of the weekend is definitely a big win. And there's arguments to even say, considering how the results shook out, that they probably might have been fighting for the fastest car of the weekend. Lando was battling with Kimi Antonelli basically almost the entire back half of the race before ultimately sort of backing off and just not having, the juice to really get it done. But that's a lot better than what we've seen in the past with the leading Mercedes sort of just driving off into the distance. So a hugely impressive weekend from McLaren. Very keen to see if they are able to follow it up with a solid Canada Grand Prix. They had a very solid pace there last season, obviously different regulations, but excited to see what they can do to follow up. So congratulations, McLaren. You are my Miami Grand Prix weekend winners. All right, not everybody can be winners. There unfortunately must be a loser. And actually for this weekend, we're going the same track we've been. I think it was a big talking point for this whole weekend. It is the inverse of McLaren. It is the Scuderia Ferrari team, who are now looking at themselves potentially as the solid third fastest team on the grid. They are definitely still a half step above, maybe like a step and a half above for Red Bull. But at the same time, it must be a bit jarring for them to go from the beginning part of the season where they were routinely fighting Mercedes for wins to now looking down the barrel of potentially being another step behind where many thought they would, now that McLaren has gotten up and going. There's going to be a lot of soul searching going on in Maranello over the course of this next break, and we'll be keen and very eagerly awaiting to see what Ferrari can break out in Canada. But like I mentioned in the quick hit section, Canada has not always been kind to Ferrari, and so we will be very interested to see what they can pull out there. It is going to very quickly reach a very interesting inflection point on the season for Ferrari and its fans. And this weekend, while it was a solid result, I think the Charles Leclerc 20-second penalty at the end of the race very clearly sums up probably how Ferrari is actually feeling when it was all said and done. All right, let's quickly go through our predictions we made before the weekend began. And boy, do I say quick, because I did not cook this weekend. Let's kick things off with my pick for biggest positive surprise. I went for Nico Hülkenberg, who has had a very solid start to the season, but has yet to score in the points. And I think I may have cursed him just a little bit too much, because he did not have a very good weekend at all. And we're just going to leave it at that and move on. Someone who looked like they were going to have a good weekend, but ultimately did not, is Pierre Gasly, who in the Grand Prix did a full pirouette into a very nice nose stand on the outside barrier of the hairpin at the end of the long straight, thanks to Liam Lawson. So a bit of a disappointing finish for Pierre Gasly, who has had an unbelievable start to 2026. I do not expect him to stay down for very long. I think that Alpine has proven itself to be a very good car. Franco Colapinto, his teammate, ended up finishing well into the points. And so potentially without Liam Lawson, I'm not getting this point here. But at the same time, I'm taking what I can get it, because points were hard to come by for me this weekend. Let's go ahead and move on now to my qualifying top three. I had a Kimi Antonelli pole position, a George Russell P2, and an Oscar Piastri P3. Yes, no, and no. Thanks to Kimi Antonelli taking pole position, I do get 1 point for getting the position correct. But George Russell severely let me down, and Oscar Piastri did not seem to have the same pace that Lando did, or even potentially others did, in terms of qualifying pace. Sprint winner, I actually went with George Russell here. I thought we were going to have a bit of a return of George Russell this weekend. In reality, I think I kind of jinxed him, because he might have had one of the tougher weekends of anyone on the grid, at least in the top 4 teams. I think that goes to show in my race podium prediction, which I had a George Russell win, an Oscar Piastri P2, and a Charles Leclerc P3. Not only did I only get Oscar Piastri into the top 3 correctly, it was also in the incorrect position. So only a half point, and George Russell and Charles Leclerc finished much off of the podium spots. And so it is a tough weekend for me when it comes to the race podium. And I'm definitely going to be rethinking some things when it comes to both Ferrari and George Russell. So keep an eye on that as we move now towards Canada. And then finally, my one crazy prediction, I predicted that at least one Ferrari car would finish behind a Haas. And this was a little touch and go there for a little bit, but ultimately it just looks like Haas did not have the pace this weekend. And not only that, Ferrari was still good enough, obviously, even with Lewis Hamilton's damage. They were pretty much comfortably well into the points, and Haas flirted with, I think they finished 11th and 13th. They were flirting there right there to finish in the points, but definitely not anywhere close to Ferrari. So no points for me on that. So let's go ahead and take a look. My 2.5 points on the weekend is a respectable, but compared to others, they definitely had me beat. Take a look at the points after the race weekend is over. There is a new leader in our predictions championship. British TTG takes the lead on 14.5 points. F1 Inferno and myself are now tied on 14 points. And so we are only half point back from the lead. So it is going to heat up as we head towards this Canada, waiting for the Canada Grand Prix. Spectral comes back this week and has an okay weekend, joining me and getting 2.5 points, and now sits on 7 points. And Sentinel, unfortunately, did not make it into predictions this week and remains on 2 points. So predictions championship is heating up. Once again, if you're interested in joining the predictions championship, it is never too late. If you truly think you know wheel, you can head to the link down below in the join the Discord, and every week leading up to a Grand Prix weekend, I'll make a call for these exact same predictions we just went over, and you yourself can prove that you know the most wheel. But that leaves us with only a couple things to talk about left, beginning with our 3 lingering questions. First off, how will Ferrari respond to seemingly falling behind. It definitely is feeling, as I mentioned many times this video, like an inflection point for Ferrari pretty early on into these regulations. Now, they very well may bounce back in Canada and prove us all wrong, but at the same time, it must be a little disheartening to see McLaren show up as well as they did, especially when you had pretty securely cemented yourself as the consensus second fastest car up to Miami. And now I think me, and including a lot of other people, are potentially second guessing that pretty quickly. So we'll see how they respond to this. Sort of a double-edged, same point we talked about earlier. Is Mercedes sweating how good McLaren are looking? Obviously, McLaren taking the win in the sprint race isn't going to be the end of the world for them. Kimi Antonelli still did take the win in the Grand Prix, but McLaren have decided to show up. And whether or not it was just a one weekend, one-off, who knows? But ultimately, if McLaren are going to be putting in results like this, it might get a bit uncomfortable for Mercedes depending on how their upgrade tree looks like over the course of the season. I'll be watching that with great intensity. And then finally, the last question. We saw some regulation changes on the long break between Japan and Miami. Will there be any other changes made to these regulations following the Miami Grand Prix? It is going to be very interesting to see what the FIA does. They've talked about not wanting to make these rash, quick judgment decisions, but at the same time, I and with pretty much everybody else still understand that there needs to be more done when it comes to the regulations. And so we'll see if anything is made and adjusted for going into Canada, or if we run it back with the same ones we did in Miami. So time will tell. All right, that leaves us with one final question left. What is next for Formula One? As we mentioned many a time, F1 now heads to Canada to race around the Montreal street circuit. It is going to be a whole heck of a lot of fun. Canada has always been one of the more interesting tracks in terms of layout into my brain. A lot of long straights, but also a few hard braking zones, as well as some quick and fast corners that will test not only these guys on the brakes, but also their following prowess. Last season, we saw a Russell, Verstappen, Antonelli podium, a double Mercedes podium a year ago. It definitely feels like it's leaning that way. Will Verstappen do enough to get back on the podium? Time will tell. It looked like he was in for a pretty good shot this weekend before ultimately falling short. So it'll be very interesting to see what he can do. But who will finish on the podium? Time will tell. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one. Thank you for showing up and making it this far into the video. If you did, leave a like rating. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, subscribe down below, join our small little community, and we would love to have you join in on the discussions. And as always, leave a comment down below what you thought of Miami as we now head into another extended break before Canada. I, for one, am really disheartened by these long breaks. It is tough, and I can't wait for Canada to get here lickety-split. But that will do it for me here in this one. We will be back for F1 the week of the Canadian Grand Prix to make our predictions, as well as we'll be live streaming occasionally here on iRacing and doing some sim racing on the side as well. But that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.